Harvard psychologist and best-selling author Steven Pinker says people dealing with the challenges of climate change need to think more broadly and be realistic about the risks of being too focused on the singular goal of net zero carbon dioxide emissions. Professor Pinker told former Australian Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson's Conversations podcast this past month that the rejection of fossil fuels too quickly will be catastrophic for people in poorer countries. He says a shift to natural gas as a transition fossil fuel and to nuclear power as a reliable form of cleaner energy is also essential.
You can't turn off coal and oil today because people would starve and poor people would stay poor, and they're going to refuse. They're not going to stay poor.
People who can't feed their families are hardly going to be concerned about the environment. And there would be an awful lot of people in that category who could do catastrophic damage.
When you realize that the problem is not just eliminating emissions, but eliminating emissions and lifting people out of poverty and not sinking back into poverty, if the problem is how do we trade those off, how do we achieve both, then it changes your focus. The focus is then on, first of all, on developing carbon-free, abundant, scalable and affordable sources of energy, of which I myself believe that the nuclear is right up there. I mean, together with new forms of storage for the intermittent energy from renewables like solar and wind, which by themselves can't power an economy because they don't run 24/7.
Pinker says that may also need to involve some kind of carbon tax to provide an economic incentive to produce less carbon.
So that people pay for the damage they do by burning fossil fuels, and that's just a basic principle of economics. You get less bad stuff if you force people to pay for the bad stuff that they do.
That's Professor Steven Pinker speaking with John Anderson. You can see the whole interview on John Anderson's Conversations podcast just by Googling it up. But not everybody thinks that a carbon tax is a good idea, as we well know from all the debate around Australian Labor government's introduction of one in the early 2010s and the removal of it by the Liberals soon after. Here's the problem with introducing a tax to try to shift human behaviour. You get, surprise, unintended consequences. This is a good little summary explanation from America's Clear Energy Alliance.
When the carbon producers are taxed, those costs will simply be passed on to consumers. And since energy is part of everything we do, it means everything will get more expensive. You liking this idea yet? Wait a minute, the promoters of a carbon tax assure us that the government will return that money to us in a rebate check. That's the dividend part. But that begs the question, why make everything more expensive just so the government can give some of what we spend back to us? Well, they say, this is what we must do to fight climate change. The idea is if fossil energy costs more, people will use less of it. But that's not entirely true. People who can afford to pay more for energy will mostly keep using it as they always have. But the poorest among us, those who spend the highest percentage of their income on energy, will get hammered. But carbon taxers say the poor will get more money back than the middle and upper classes. Okay, so what we've got here is another wealth redistribution scheme. Of course, anyone who has ever witnessed government in action knows that there is a giant cost to any program bureaucrats administer. And what would American manufacturers do if it suddenly got much more expensive to build things in the U.S.? That's right. Some of them would simply relocate to other countries or go out of business because they can't compete with companies outside the U.S. that have less stringent environmental regulations. A study commissioned by the National Association of Manufacturers found that a carbon tax would destroy between 4 and 20 million American jobs. A carbon tax is one of those things that the more you look at it, the dumber it gets.
That video was put together by the pro-fossil fuel group, the Clear Energy Alliance in the US, and it's available on their website in full. If you enjoyed that content, there's lots more where that came from. The Other Side Australia is back every Tuesday and Friday on ADH TV and all good podcast platforms. It's your weekly short circuit summary of the best news commentary from Australia and abroad. Don't miss it.